Chapter 14. Murdoch's Choice. They were, by Casper's calculation, about 1 week away from reaching Warvonia. The past 12 days had been hard ones at sea, with constant reminders of the crew they'd lost and the extra work everyone had to do. Still, amidst the fatigue, Jensen felt a camaraderie with those aboard the Queenie, quite unlike anything he'd experienced before. Yes, they had lost their bounty. It might be the first time ever for a Murdoch voyage, but everyone was glad to be sailing home. Once back in Warvonia, there would be brief respite to see loved ones and settle affairs on land, and then it would be on to the next job. And if many of the crew were being honest, it was a relief to be free of the pressures of trying to attain the mastery bar. For Jensen, the hardest thing was coming to grips with the reality that Seadred and his crew would be the ones to reach it. "Surely, once the guild hears of what they did," he said one day to Casper, "they'll strip him of that privilege." Casper merely shrugged.
"Crews never speak of how they win or lose their charges, especially if they lose to each other. That's the Seafaring Guild's tradition in Warvonia."
"Even if they did," said Yancey, "the guild wouldn't listen. They don't bother their precious selves with anything that happens outside of Tuscany, or even Rockney for that matter. It would be the word of Seadred's crew against ours. They'll just deny ever having hired Grimkin mercenaries, they're all dead anyway, and they'll say the deaths on our crew are our business. No help to be gained from those goons." "Aye," said Rosh, "lick your wounds and get ready for the next job. That's all they're about." "Bottle in your afflictions, and they bottle in their questions," Jensen said, knowing the ways of Warvonia's guild. "It seems ghastly." Harsh as it was, however, he knew it was reality, particularly within the league of specialized high-value seafarers that counted Murdoch among them.
"It goes both ways," said Dippy. "It's just as well for us if the guild never knows that we had to rescue the captain from a Gukanian prison, taking down dozens of their soldiers in the process."
Simply losing to Seadred was one thing. Jensen felt especially concerned that Garrick Rummy was about to be deemed a Grand Master in the guild. This had not happened since well before any of their lifetimes, so it was hard to know with certainty how this would affect their crew. It was a designation supported by ancient kingdom decree, not officially above the provincial guilders, but Chief Pratt might have limited influence should the Grand Master appeal to higher authorities. Thus, Jensen wondered with grave concern how Seadred's new status could influence the jobs they took, the oversight received, changes to the crew, provisions allowed, and any other matter of guild business. Life in Warvonia's Seafaring Guild might be much tougher from here. As much as that bothered Jensen, life otherwise aboard the Queenie had turned some interesting corners. Relationships managed to develop, if even in a furtive, hole-in-corner sort of way. Yvette had been seen passively stroking Casper's beard, endearing him with the occasional coquettish smile. "Fishin' for more daggers, shrew?" Yancey called out one afternoon, as Yvette hung about the helm for no conceivably productive reason. "Only to shove it down your grog-hole," she answered with mock geniality. Boomer seemed to be having the time of his life. He'd fashioned himself a headscarf out of scrap cloth and strutted about the ship holding his miniature cutlass, echoing orders issued throughout the ship. "Steady the braces there," Dippy called out.
"Stick a braces, kee-kee-kee,"
Boomer repeated, adding his animalistic cackle.
"Heave-ho the starboard lines! Hee-ho, star salines! Kee-kee-kee!"
And so it went. Boomer also had an enduring infatuation with the chickens. At first, Jackson shooed him away.
"Get down, furball,"
he shouted, waving a ladle.
"Those chickens aren't snacks, man."
Boomer shook his head fervently and chittered back at them as though trying to make a serious point. Then one morning, a chicken managed to escape as Jackson gathered eggs. He squealed in panic as Boomer ran up to it. When Boomer delicately stroked its feathers and carried it back to its cage, cooing all the way, everyone realized that he meant the poultry no harm. It turned out their fitful little mascot didn't want to eat the chickens. He was simply being affectionate. Captain Murdoch, for his part, spent more time than usual in his cabin. This job, most assumed, had been especially hard on him. His biggest rival had prevailed, and they had suffered heavy losses, with no prize but a pile of battle-used Gukanian swords and armor to show for it. Most days he emerged from his cabin, made his rounds with curt greetings and status inquiries, and then no one would see him again for hours. On one occasion, the captain approached Jensen. "How fares the leg, young sir?"
"Slower recovery than I'd like, but coming along," Jensen said.
The captain lifted his pant leg, patting the dark gray graphenite beneath. "Keep it up and you'll soon earn one of these beauties."
"I'll consider it an honor, should it come to that."
"Everything copacetic with our course?"
"Certainly, sir,"
Jensen said, a bit tentatively. Zale grunted, lingering a moment. There's a matter I wanted to speak with you about, related to this resolite of yours." Jensen swallowed.
"Captain, I don't mean to cause a stir by having it, but—"
"Say no more," Murdoch said. "Fulger informed me of your talk before the whole cave debacle. I just wanted to apologize for giving you grief about it." Relief swept over Jensen. He had worried that punishment was coming for his having the resolite. Now the captain was actually apologizing to him.
"Oh, please, sir, think nothing of it."
"Also, I want to thank you for helping to protect my daughter through all of this. I know she can be headstrong and contrary, but you always stuck by her."
"I'd give my life for her, sir. Please know that."
Murdoch nodded. "I know you would, and I take comfort in that." Jensen felt he should tread carefully here. Through experience, he knew that this was a delicate subject to speak of with Murdoch.
"She is much conflicted about being with a sailor," Jensen said. "I had hoped, perhaps, over time, that—"
"That she might change?" Murdoch said with a light chuckle. "We Murdochs are a stubborn lot, thick-skinned as hippos."
"Yes, I have noticed."
He said this to be light-hearted, but truly his heart felt heavy, worried about how he could ever truly be the man Starlina deserved. Murdoch looked out over the railing. "Starlina wants someone she can feel close to, someone accessible. If I'm being truly honest, she wants what I haven't been. It's not unreasonable for her to want that." Jensen looked down.
"I suppose you're right."
"An old, wise sailor once told me," Murdoch said, "that enough time spent on the sea will give anyone a new perspective on life. Add that to the already profound effects of love and, well, I guess you just never know."
"Indeed, sir. You never know."
Murdoch clapped Jensen's arm. "Things have a way of working out, Jensen. And just perhaps it could be possible for a sailor to sit out a voyage every now and then. The captain's daughter must be well looked after, you know." He winked. "And we have the needs of Starlina to consider, don't we?" Jensen felt a spark of hope at the possibility that Starlina's father might actually be rooting for him.
"We absolutely do. A huge responsibility, to be sure."
"One more thing," Murdoch said. "You once asked for my blessing to propose to her. I want you to know you have it." Jensen felt like leaping as high as the crow's nest.
"Thank you, Captain. That means the world to me, sir."
Murdoch clasped Jensen's hand in a firm shake. "You're a good man, Jensen."
"Not so good as you, sir."
"You just might get there," said Murdoch with a chuckle. "Right. Good luck, sailor." With that, Murdoch walked back to his cabin. Amazing as that was, Starlina had perhaps surprised Jensen most of all. She had, during most of the voyage to Gukan, kept to her quarters and to herself. On this voyage home, She actually pitched in as one of the crew. She helped to pull the salyards. She helped wiggle belly in the galley. She helped swab the deck and coil the lines. The cut she'd received across her abdomen from sea dread stung severely and often for a while. Yancey, who had learned some basic medicinal remedies in his time as quartermaster, helped her to bandage it with a poultice of herbs and honey. "And when you're done with it, you could eat it," Yancey said. "I wouldn't personally, but you could." The cut itself was no joking matter to Starlina, though. It was most likely to leave a lifelong scar. Late one evening she stayed upon the quarterdeck with Jensen as he took his shift at the helm. The breeze was warm and pleasant. The sky, a beautiful twilight banded by the rings high above, and the closest crew members were busy down around the mast. Jensen had much on his mind, not the least of which was his earlier conversation with the captain. He felt inexplicably nervous. Although he had the blessing of Starlina's father, Jensen still worried that it wouldn't be enough. Jensen was still a sailor. He would still be gone for long voyages. She might never be able to accept that, and he realized it might not be fair to expect her to. "It really doesn't look all that difficult," she said. "Is that so?" Jensen laughed, holding the wheel steady. "You're just standing there." Jensen made a show of indignation. "It's not just about standing here." She stepped up closer. "How do you know where you're going?" "Are you asking me how to be a sailor?" "I merely wonder how you know we're going in the right direction, that we won't end up ashore on the tip of Acadia." "Ah," said Jensen. "Then you've taken an interest in how to navigate at sea." She raised an eyebrow. "We are at sea, aren't we?" "That we are, milady." "Very well, then. A crash course." Starlina chortled. "So long as we're not crashing, of course." "The rings, you see, are our primary navigational tool. We can measure their position from the horizon to determine where we are against Casper's maps and charts." He looked into her bright, gorgeous eyes. She was watching him intently, so he continued. "We've oriented our map and compass, and using that, Casper currently has our bearing at 225 degrees, which happens to be southwest. Visually, a bit to the right of the ring's apex, which of course mark the south." "How fascinating," she said, smiling. "And so, this is me, standing here, yes, but also ensuring we stay on our determined course. Sometimes it takes quite an effort to keep it steady, you know." "May I give it a try?" It was a question he never thought he'd hear from her. His heart pounded with joy. Starlina, the anti-sailor, asking to steer the ship. Now I believe I've seen it all. He stepped to the side, taking care not to allow the wheel to careen. She took hold of the wheel, momentarily struggling against its pull. "It really doesn't like to stay in position, does it?" Jensen laughed. "Staying on course is ever a balance between the wind, the sail, and the currents. Veering even a small amount could take you miles in the wrong direction. Here, allow me." Reaching from behind her, he placed his hands over hers. Her hair streamed about his face, and he breathed her in, a scent remarkably exhilarating despite the limited hygiene of sea life. "I can feel that you are very much in control, Jensen Carrick," she said. "Of our ship's navigation, I suppose you're right." "But of nothing else?" "Of the rest of life? Who am I to say?" He inhaled deeply of the warm breeze. He watched his hands upon hers, together, and in this moment, solely responsible for the direction of their course. "I suppose only time will tell," he said. Starlina entered the captain's cabin to find her father sitting pensively at his desk, looking over papers. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. "Ah," he said after a moment. "Pleasant afternoon, Starlina. Is everything okay?" She took a seat in one of the cushy armchairs. "You tell me." "What do you mean?" "Clearly you're not yourself." We barely see you out on the deck anymore." He rubbed at his chin. "Just had a lot on my mind." Starlina looked upon the desk where Fulger's Annalase rested. "What do you intend to do with the Novidian?" He turned in his chair and picked up the weapon, looking it over. "In all honesty, I have no idea. Fulger told me to seek out his order." "Will you?" He shrugged. "Maybe I will." "Once he had me hold that dagger." She stared at it in remembrance. "It wasn't anything like when Fulger held it, but it glowed for me. He seemed to think that meant something." Her father was watching her, expressionless. "Then in the cave, he had me touch that," she shook her head, "cursed dome thing, and somehow he drew energy from me." He nodded. "You and I. We have something unique in our lineage, going back to when our ancestor, Augustus Macpherson, banished the Grimstone from Tuscany and sealed it away in Gucan to save the land. It's that something in our lineage that gives us a connection with Novidian." She leaned back, thoughtful. "Does it concern you at all? I mean, Macpherson removed the Grimstone from Tuscany, and now Seadred is taking it back there. We would have taken it back there. Couldn't that be dangerous?" Her father blinked, seeming to consider that. "Fulger wanted it to be back under the watchful eye of the Order. He seemed to think that Gucan had become such a dark place that it was no longer safe there. I saw visions associated with that Grimstone there, and it is not to be trifled with." "Dark is right," Starlina said. "Still, Seadred is taking it right to the person who wanted it. It just doesn't quite feel right." "Yes. Well, personally, I think Seadred will find he's bitten off more than he can chew."
"And what kind of person actually seeks some dark object like that anyway? Didn't he tell you it would somehow help the light of the land? It seems awfully backwards."
Her father smiled. "I say we keep an eye on these developments. You've got a keen instinct about you, Starlina."
"Well, I am a Murdoch, after all."
Her father's eyes softened, and the look she got from them was one of great pride. "Ah, that you are, my dear. But not just a Murdoch. A Macpherson." Jensen looked out from the taffrail of the stern deck, watching the sun as it crept below the horizon. His ears took in the tranquil sound of the ship cutting through the water, chasing white waves from the hull and leaving a trail in its wake. They were less than 3 days away from Warvonia. Nobody knew how long they would stay ashore before their next voyage. There were already whisperings among the crew that some would seek a transfer, following the epic failure of this trip. This, of course, came from those of lesser experience and, generally, lesser ability. Jensen was not among them. As with the officers, Daubernaum, Casper, Yancey, Roche, Yvette, he was a Murdoch's mate through and through. They all knew the outcome of this voyage wasn't a failure of their captains. Rather, it was a sabotage of Seadred. Jensen very much wondered what would transpire if and when their path crossed again with Garrick Rummy. Whether or not Captain Murdoch would ever condone any open acts of revenge, the crew of Murdoch had no small score to settle with that fiendish rogue. Jensen felt absently for an object in his pocket. It was a thing that he had quite meant to be without before this voyage even began, if only he'd been able to get Starlina to accept it.
"I find it special, you know," Starlina said from behind, "to be aboard my father's ship as it returns from a daring voyage such as this."
Beaming, Jensen turned around. Once again, the pendant of lilac guntapite hung below her neck.
"You never know where we'll sail to next. It'll be somewhere away from Warvonia. And it'll be somewhere grand, I'm sure."
She joined him beside the taffrail, standing right by him, so that their arms touched. Her makeshift shirt had no sleeves, and her skin was warm and soft against his.
"Being surrounded by this view on all sides, the absolute perfect backdrop, isn't it?"
"It is beautiful," he said.
"It's what every sailor dreams of," she said. "These
Open waters, the horizon laid out before you. It's like freedom." She looked at him with an impish smile. "That's what someone told me once." He chuckled. "The words of a wise man, a real keeper." His fingers were restless inside his pocket. "I love the ocean," he said. "I love this ship, and the adventure, and sailing under your father." He looked into her eyes, bright and wide, and staring back into his. "But I would give it all up for the greatest love of them all. You, Starlina. But then you wouldn't be you, would you? And we can't have that." "I'm not me without you," he said. He took her hand, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath. I have a question for you." She placed a finger over his lips. "Sailors don't ask questions," she said, leaning in very close. "They take action." And with the water all around them, they kissed longingly. He swam in her goodness, drinking her in, forgetting everything he'd ever been worried about. His hand cradled her cheek, and his nostrils filled with her scent. Long gone was the smell of rosewater. It had been washed away, replaced by something even more invigorating. The sea. It was about the 4th hour of the morning when Zale stood atop the stern of his ship, leaning against the aft ballista in thought. He was alone. Casper had just relieved Jensen of helm's duty on the quarterdeck below. When they reached Warvonia in about 2 days' time, their rest would be well deserved. He and his officers would have their work cut out for them once back to shore. He already assumed several of the deckhands would attempt to transfer, hoping for captains who take jobs with less risk and danger. They would need to be replaced, but this was not entirely unfamiliar to Zale. Then, there was the far more unpleasant business of having to inform the guild of those crew members lost in action. That was a relatively sterile process, mostly paperwork, and no questions asked about the details. Any family and loved ones of those men, however, would demand and deserve more answers. He couldn't bring himself to even think about the mastery bar anymore. He figured the guilders would want to work him to the death. He had already decided that, if he wanted a month off with his wife and family, he would take it, and to go with the guilders. By now, the choice of family over career was an easy one for him. The harder choice, the one he'd wrestled with over their 3-week voyage home, had to do with the object in his pocket. He pulled it out. An object like a small, flat slab of shale in his hand, clearly the broken shard of something larger. It was the Grimstone. Either now or very soon, down in Miskune, Seadred was about to present an empty canister to what would certainly be a most displeased Vidimir. It seemed that old Puffy Pants would not reach the mastery bar this year after all. That afforded Zale a most satisfying chuckle. He stared at the Grimstone. "So much evil in something so small," he whispered, thinking of Fulgur. "I know you will do right," he had said. "Your heart is good." What exactly was right was what Zale had deliberated with himself over and over again all the way home. His crew had every right to the payoff this object could bring. It was for this object that Zale had turned away 2 easier charges. It was for this job that 9 men had died. But the lives of 9 could pale in comparison to what Zale had seen in the visions. If true, the destruction this object was capable of might affect the entire kingdom, maybe even beyond. This concept of saving the land by replacing the light with this, there had to be a better way. His daughter and his granddaughters would not grow up in a haunted, lightless world like that, not if he had anything to say about it. To bring the object back to Tuscany seemed to be what Fulgur had intended. It would be under the Order's watch, supposedly safe. But his own ancestor, Macpherson, had gone through great lengths to take it far from there, far from the light. And so, he had a choice. Perhaps the greatest choice of his life. "What to do with you?" he spoke softly. Even in his hand, he somehow felt a sort of contempt from the object, as though it hated being within his grasp. He closed his eyes in thought. He saw the gentle smile of his wife Lola. He heard the joyous laughter of his young granddaughters. He saw Starlina and Jensen, his crew, the city of Warvonia that he loved. Not even opening his eyes to see it again, he threw back his arm and launched it to the sea. "You, Fulgur, are of the Order," he said. "Now you keep it safe." Zale Murdoch had made his choice. The next adventure of Captain Zale the Gale Murdoch, Heroes of Time Legends, Murdoch's Shadow, now available from heroesoftime.com and your favorite online retailers. This has been Heroes of Time Legends, Murdoch's Choice. Written by Wayne Kramer. Narrated by Ed Romanoff. Copyright 2021 by Wayne Kramer and Heroes of Time Productions, LLC. Production copyright 2021 Wayne Kramer and Heroes of Time Productions, LLC. Audiobook published by Twin Flames Studios.